Hi Yogi, and welcome to another Asana Lab with me, Oceana. In today's episode, of course, we've arrived at part 2 of our deep dive into Vinyasas, which means that if you haven't seen part 1, I will link it here for you. I do highly recommend that you watch that first. Some of this is not going to make a huge amount of sense without it. And in today's episode specifically, I'll be talking about the injury that is most commonly associated with Vinyasas. I'll be giving you a little bit of anatomy information related to that. I'll also be giving you, of course, my 2 cents as to why I think those injuries are happening. And I will talk you through the alignment, the breath, the transitions of a typical Vinyasa. I'll also give you some modifications and variations that you might encounter in your regular classes, and all of that is going to be time-stamped below so that you can easily hop around this video. Now we will jump right in to the elephant in the chaturanga shaped room here, and that of course is rotator cuff injuries. So yes, it is true that yoga does have a fairly high rate of rotator cuff injuries, especially when you compare yoga to any other low impact activity. And typically, I'm not going to mention any names, but certainly physiotherapists do like to blame those injuries, not just on Vinyasas, but very specifically on Chaturanga Dandasana, the 4-limbed staff pose. And I will say that I've mentioned this before actually, that for me personally, that's a bit of an oversimplified view of the world, because Chaturanga is a movement that we see in the form of a push-up normally in many other movement disciplines. Sometimes people are doing hundreds of push-ups an hour. I've said that before too, especially when we look at the CrossFit Games and competitive situations like that. And oddly enough, within those disciplines, you do not see the same rate of rotator cuff injuries, which is odd. You know, if you're going to blame that movement for everything, shouldn't that be consistent through different disciplines as well? You would think. So in order to understand why those injuries are actually happening, we do have to have a bit of a better idea of what the rotator cuff is. The rotator cuff specifically refers to 4 separate muscles. There's also a few tendons involved here, and they are predominantly concerned with keeping your humerus at the ball end, so your upper arm bone, connected into the socket of your shoulder joint. And they are also involved in raising and lowering your arms. So they are a fairly important group of muscles. And the one thing that's sort of peculiar about them, considering how important the rotator cuff muscles are, is actually that they are fairly small. So one thing that I will say at the top here is that, of course, you can do damage doing a chaturanga the wrong way, but also potentially if you're coming into yoga and you already are lacking upper body strength, or you know that that's something you need to be working on, then potentially your rotator cuff muscles are less used to bearing weight, and then again there's a higher risk of injury really in any weight bearing pose. For me personally, I will say that I actually think that there's 2 other aspects of the Vinyasa that are potentially more to blame, and some of that I've sort of already prefaced in part 1 of this mini-series, and that is that the Vinyasa was originally intended for us to come all the way fully to the ground with our entire body, which would give the muscles in the shoulders the option to reset before we go into the back bend. So that is one of my personal suspicions, that actually when you are transitioning from chaturanga to the back bend of upward facing dog in mid-air, with all of your body weight suspended essentially from your rotator cuff muscles, that there is a potential in that transition for injuries to occur. because that is quite a lot of weight to go onto the rotator cuff. And I'll briefly demonstrate that just so that it is a little bit more clear, especially sometimes these things are hard to imagine. So if I start in a high plank position, from there I would lower down and tuck the elbows in, shoulders traveling forward. Now here I'm suspending from the rotator cuffs, hanging onto my shoulders, especially if they're not particularly strong. And then I have to transition in midair into my upward facing dog. So you could see how that also is quite an odd transition, because the shoulders essentially have to change the position they're in from here being in actually what I would refer to as a neutral position, because this is the same position my shoulders would be in if I was sat here very casually talking to you, not thinking about them. That's the same position I want my shoulders to be in chaturanga, to the position of a back bend where your shoulder blades are hugging in and slightly pressing up so that you can lift and raise the chest, taking you into a deeper back bend in the thoracic spine, your upper spine. The other thing that I think factors in as well, and this is something that I had sort of mentioned, that Krishnamacharya was a very influential teacher and is often referred to as the father of modern yoga. As such, it is fairly tricky to find a teacher that isn't somehow related to his lineage, especially in the Western world, and I am no exception. So one of my teachers, Shiva Ray, is actually a student of Krishnamacharya's grandson, Desikachar. And through her, I found out that Krishnamacharya taught the majority of his students with what was usually between, I think, a 10 to 18 second breath count. So his students would inhale for 10 to 18 seconds. Then there would be a breath retention. So they would hold the breath, which is referred to as kumbhaka in yoga. They would hold the breath for about 5 to 10 seconds. And then again, they would exhale for a further 10 to 18 seconds. And if you consider how slow that breath cycle is, and that each movement in the vinyasa is associated to one breath. So, let's say we're coming forward from a downward dog into our high plank, that would take 10 to 18 seconds. Then we would lower down to chaturanga for 10 to 18 seconds. And in between those poses, we're holding the pose for 5 to 10 seconds before we move on to the next one. What that does is really it gives the muscles the opportunity to stabilize and to transition in a controlled way. And if you compare that to how vinyasas are often taught in modern yoga classes, especially, power yoga or faster practices, where the breath count is much, much faster, oftentimes vinyasas will be cued as inhale to high plank, exhale chaturanga, inhale upward dog, exhale downward dog. That does not leave a lot of room for error or for your muscles to adapt slowly to that change in movement and the change in weight distribution in your body. Again, there's a good possibility that injury would occur in that faster paced practice, and that actually the vinyasa itself might not be to blame, but it's actually this kind of almost a corruption of how it's performed as a movement with the breath that is more of the issue potentially. But again, as I've said, this is really my 2 cents, and you sort of do have to make up your own mind because it is your own practice. So we will talk a little bit about the alignment here. As I said previously, I am not going to be talking about the specific alignment of these poses. I've dissected those separately. I'm really focusing a lot more on the transitions here between the poses. So, as always, I will demonstrate this for you, which means you might want to watch this. You may want to practice with me if you prefer. I will also be cueing the breath because that's part of a vinyasa. But do notice, or note at least, that especially if you're a beginner student, matching your breath with the movement can be quite tricky. But certainly, again, if you're able to slow your practice down, then that is more achievable than if you're going very, very fast paced. That's not a particularly natural breath cycle. And I think the other thing to always remember, especially if you're new to yoga practice, is that a lot of times we tend to see people moving very fast through their physical yoga practice, and we often associate that with someone being very good at yoga. But that's not necessarily the case. I would actually say from my experience that the slower you go, the more strength that requires and the more integrity and knowledge of the postures you need, and actually the safer it is. So I would say that the advanced student will know to slow their practice down, and that is a very advanced move. So I am going to come into my vinyasas from a downward dog, which isn't always where they start, but oftentimes they do start in a downward dog. So typical downward dog alignment, feet hip distance, hands shoulder distance, pressing through index finger and thumb, spinning my inner elbows forward, lifting sitting bones up and back. As I inhale, I'm going to come forward until my shoulders stack on top of the wrist in a high plank position. And from there, tucking in my front body so that I can lengthen crown of the head forward, heels moving back. As I exhale here, I'm going to send my shoulders forward so that my elbows stay on top of the wrists. I might even come onto my big toes. And then either I'm rolling over my big toes or I'm untucking the feet into my upward facing dog, using my hands to pull the chest forward and up, lifting and pressing the floor away. And as I exhale, I roll over the toes, or again, I can tuck the toes under as I transition back into my downward facing dog on the exhale. So again, one time here, very slowly, inhale, I come forward to high plank. Exhale, coming down, Chaturanga Dandasana. Inhale into upward facing dog. And exhale back to downward facing dog. And as I said, I would say the most important part in order to maintain the health of your shoulders, if you're practicing that full version of vinyasa, then is certainly to slow the movement down as much as possible, and also to keep your shoulders in that neutral position. So the position your shoulders would typically be in if you were stood upright without thinking about it, if you were walking, there should not be any pinching, strain, or rising of your shoulders towards your ears. If that's the case, it's usually a sign that there isn't quite enough strength in the shoulder joint to support that full version of the movement. And if that's the case, it's often, in my opinion, the thing that I see the most and that pains me the most to see in my students is when people's egos get in the way of them doing the right modification. So I do urge you to actually prioritize the health of your body and shoulders, and to not let your ego get in the way of simply allowing your knees to lower down first to support a better version of vinyasas. So my number one way of modifying this movement, either if there's not enough strength, maybe there's some shoulder issues, some wrist issues going on, is always from your high plank to lower the knees very, very gently down first. Again, you want to think about moving in slow motion as you do that. And then similar, or exactly the same actually, you're in this slightly elongated tabletop. You tuck the elbows in with the inner elbows spinning forward. The shoulders are soft and neutral. And in slow motion with your gaze forward at the front of the mat, you start to lower the chest towards the floor, slower than you'd like to. And once the chest touches down, then you press the tops of the feet into the ground and lift into your cobra pose instead of upward facing dog, really lifting from the back body. And as you exhale, you press back via the knees into downward facing dog. And that would be my number one suggestion. And it's also a very sort of accommodating thing to be doing if you're practicing as part of a public vinyasa class where the teacher is less able to focus on your specific needs and they have a lot of people to deal with. Now, if very specifically there are more strenuous or tricky sort of wrist or shoulder issues going on, then another option is that instead of being in a high plank to begin with, you might start in a forearm or low plank here. So similarly here, just the shoulders are on top of the elbows instead of your wrists, and then you lower your hips all the way to the ground. You untuck the toes, the elbows draw back into a Sphinx pose. And as you exhale, you tuck the toes under via the knees, walk the feet into a dolphin pose. So essentially you've done a lot of the same movements, simply with your forearms on the ground, which takes all of the strain out of your wrists if you're dealing with a wrist injury or recent surgery. And it also does allow for a slightly different support in your shoulders, which can be useful for some people who have had rotator cuff injuries in the past. In terms of variations, as I've probably mentioned before, there's only really one variation that I personally teach and that I've come across in classes sort of frequently. I'm going to shimmy my yoga mat slightly down because it's sort of taking a walk over here. So essentially, I tend to refer to this as a 3-point vinyasa, although possibly other teachers call it by different names, maybe a one-legged vinyasa. So from here, in that downward dog, we would start in a 3-legged dog, lifting one leg up and back. Inhale forward into a 3-point plank here with the legs still lifted, and then coming down through chaturanga until the top leg comes to the floor, and then we flip the other foot over as well into our upward facing dog as we exhale, coming back into our traditional downward facing dog. And I would say that that about covers the vinyasas for you. And hopefully I've answered most of your questions here. Of course, if I've left anything out, let me know in the comments. I always love hearing from you all. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, share it with your friends and spread the good word. And of course, if you want to find me anywhere else online, all of that information is in the video description. Hopefully I will see you back here on the mat very soon, Yogi. And thank you so much for joining me today. Bye.